Thank you, Adonis. Thank you for coming. So many people I did not expect. It makes me thankful, but also a little bit humble. As some of you may notice, I made a small error in the first slide. Unfortunately, I have very competent colleagues who immediately pointed out that I made a mistake in the language and corrected it. Maybe I make some imperfections during my presentation today, so please forgive me. What I would like to do is to give a very broad overview, not specifically focusing neither United States, United Kingdom, Germany, neither speaking about Lithuania or Latvia or any other country. I just want to explore a little bit the parameters that we need to possibly answer this question. I think it is, perhaps from the very beginning of museum history, a question that haunts our profession. But the relevancy of discussing this topic today is, I think, because more than ever, the traditions, the museological traditions, are being challenged, are being questioned. And today I will make my contribution to this discourse. My contribution today, my lecture today, is the third of a series of 4 public lectures, 2 in Vilnius, 1 in Joliet, and 1 to come next month in Kaunas. So I will focus on one particular sort of question which complete the sort of issues that I discussed in the other lectures. And although there might be some overlap between the lectures, they complete each other. So when you are disappointed that I'm not referring to one particular theme, maybe you should go to YouTube and try to find the other lectures, and hope you find some consistency in what I try to talk about today and the other lectures. So for developing the basic parameters for answering this question, or to find a possible answer to this question, I need to start with a sort of historical overview. It will not too long, I hope, but I would like to go back to at least 1 year ago. 1 year ago, I was a visiting professor in Italy, in Bergamo, University of Bergamo. In the weekend, we visited this beautiful city, the city of Bellagio, Lake Como. This is to make you jealous. It is to show you the profits of being into this profession. But this week, by coincidence, this week, precisely 1 year ago, I was here visiting this city, and by coincidence, we passed this hotel. We were looking for a place to have something to drink, and to my surprise, in this hotel, Filippo Tommaso Marinetti died on, as you can see, the 2nd of December 1944. We sat down in front of this hotel, had a glass of wine to celebrate the failure of his most famous appeal. Or perhaps we drank this wine out of disappointment that his appeal was not followed. After 3 glasses of wine, we still didn't know. And actually, to be honest, this lecture is based upon these 3 glasses of wine in Bellagio. Perhaps that's why I made a mistake in the first slide. Marinetti, why do I start with Marinetti? Well, Marinetti is known best as the author of the Futurist Manifesto, which he wrote in 1909. Marinetti. And the the Futurist Manifesto was published on the front page of the most prestigious French daily newspaper, Le Figaro, on the 20th of February 1909. In museum history, this manifesto is most famous for just a few words. We want to demolish museums and libraries. The full sentence is, I quote, we want to demolish museums, libraries, and academies of all kinds, fight morality, feminism, and all opportunist and utilitarian cowardice, unquote. It's often stated that Marinetti wants to burn museums. This is not true. He wanted just to burn libraries, which is, of you, what happened in the 1930s in Germany, an uncomfortable statement. Museums should, according to the manifesto, be flooded. To quote Marinetti, divert the canals to flood the cellars of the museum. Let the glorious canvases swim ashore. Museums, Marinetti says, are cemeteries. To visit them more than once a year is dangerous for your mental health. Quote, do you want to poison yourself? Do you want to rot? For the dying, for the invalids, and for prisoners, it may be all right. It is, museum visiting, it is perhaps some sort of balm for their wounds, the admirable past at a moment when the future is denied to them. But we will have none of it. We, the young, strong, and living futurists. Unquote. By burning libraries, flooding museums, and undermining monuments, these young, strong, and living futurists should, and I quote again, deliver Italy from its gangrene of professors, archaeologists, tourist guides, and antiquaries, and perhaps I should add, museologists as well. The Futurist Manifesto was read and debated all across Europe, also here in Vilnius. Actually, we could celebrate today that Marinetti's manifesto was published in Vilnius precisely 100 years ago, because the Polish-Lithuanian newspaper Verseckas reprinted the manifesto in 1913. So I consider it to be very appropriate to quote at length from this manifesto. The Lithuanian art scene became already aware of futurist ideas a few years earlier due to the Russian artist Nikolai Kublin from St. Petersburg, who was involved in organizing exhibitions of the Vilnius Art Society in 1909 and 1910. Kublin was the author of the text Free Music, published in 1910, expressing the same ideals as expressed by Marinetti in his manifesto. Beauty exists only in struggle, to quote Marinetti again. The destruction of museums and libraries serves the purpose of liberating beauty and culture at large from the suffocation of tradition. And in the same way, Kublin suggests music should be freed. It is interesting, and not without significance, that Marinetti's criticism coincided with the canonization of the principles of the modernist museum. In 1895, the American George Brown Goode, director of the US National Museum in Washington, presented a paper at the 1895 annual meeting of the British Museums Association at Newcastle that year. In his paper, The Principles of Museum Administration, Goode summarized his ideas on museums and museum practice. The paper is considered to be the first treatise on modern museology. Goode himself expressed the hope that this treatise would not only create a critical and fruitful discussion, but that the outline proposed by him would serve as the foundation for a codification of accepted principles of museum administration. And to some extent, it did. This first phase in the canonization of the Modernist Museum was more or less completed by the publication of the proceedings of the Museographie Conference organized in 1934 by the International Office of Museums. Founded in 1926, this was the first international organization on museums. The conference took place in October-November 1934 at Madrid. It focused on the architecture and arrangement of art museums. And even though the organizers explicitly declared that museum work, and I quote, should not be codified in a rigid and uniform principles, unquote, and that their publication, quote again, does not aim to establish a doctrine, unquote, the 2 volumes that resulted from the conference might be seen as representing the standards of current practice. In my opinion, these standards, as outlined by Brown Good and in the book, The Proceedings of this Museologie conference, in my opinion, these standards of the modernist museum ideal continue to dominate the professional discourse throughout the whole of the 20th century. It is the ideal typical model of museums that has entered our collective consciousness. And when professionals, critics, journalists, politicians, and visitors conceptualize museum, they use this model. The standard, of course, did not remain uncontested. Recent critics of the model have organized themselves in the Association of Critical Heritage Studies. This association is a network of scholars and researchers working in the broad and interdisciplinary field of heritage and museum studies. Its primary aim is to promote heritage as an area of critical inquiry. And to this end, the association works to promote dialogue and networking between researchers from different fields and disciplinary backgrounds, and between researchers, practitioners, and activists. In its inaugural conference of the Association of Critical Heritage Studies was held at the University of Göteborg in Sweden in June last year, 2012. Many of the contributions to this conference showed a similar attitude as expressed by Marinetti's manifesto, though in less violent rhetoric and wrapped in academic argument. All of this is part of a growing number of books challenging the modernist ideals. These books have titles such as The New Museology, New Museum Theory and Practices, Museum Revolutions, Rules for the Revolutionary Museum, Rules for the Revolution of Museums, Reinventing the Museum, Revisualizing National History, and so on, and so on. Preparing the ground for, or reflecting on, books promoting new museum models, the responsive museum, the engaging museum, the participatory museum. It's easy to add a long list of such new models. And I apologize to the interpreters, but to mention a few: the civic museum, the democratic museum, the dialogical museum, the disruptive museum, the inclusive museum, the responsive museum, the wandering museum. Other concepts are the total museum, the global museum, and that runs from anti-museum to post-museum. What they have in common with Marinetti's manifesto is the idea of liberation. Christina Krebs has made this explicit in her book, Liberating Culture, published in 2003. The book describes how local communities, in this case, in her case, in Indonesia, can and should be involved in the process of musealization. In fact, in order to guarantee a sustainable, dynamic contribution of heritage to their culture, the musealization process should be liberated from the authoritative heritage discourse. This term, authoritative heritage discourse, this term was coined by Laura Jane Smith, among others, in her book, Uses of Heritage, published in 2006. Authoritative heritage discourse, a term referring to the standards of professional practice. At stake is the relation between three stakeholder groups: government, professionals, and communities. Throughout the 19th and 20th century, museum workers have tried to establish their occupation as a profession. An important element in the discourse was the relation with the government. The aim was professional autonomy based on an elaborate professional infrastructure with local, national, and international museums associations, studies programs, and research institutes. The books mentioned before show a paradigmatic shift in the professional discourse, sometimes described as participative turn. In my first lecture nearby at the Senate Hall of the University, as some of you were present there as well, I have spoken about this paradigmatic shift, referring to the impact of concepts of participation and participatory culture on our very definition of professionalism. In the context of this lecture, I would like again to refer to the concept used by Stephen Jay Gould of museums as guardians of the second best. Gould is one of my heroes. There are some other heroes like David Lowenthal and Kenneth Hudson that I love to quote. Stephen Jay Gould was a paleontologist and a prolific writer about evolution. Some of you may have heard about him or even read some of his work. He spoke about natural history museums quite often. But what he said is, in my opinion, relevant for many types of museums. For example, to quote, "When we have lost the living by human malfeasance, what can be more residually noble than faithful preservation and accurate documentation of often pitiable fragments," unquote. So Gould contrasts the living with the often pitiable fragments. Priority, according to Gould, should be given to protecting the living. The faithful preservation and accurate documentation of the fragments is a second best option. To some extent, the ICOM Code of Ethics for Museums can be considered as an expression of what Gould described as residual noble and the recognition of museums as second best option. In the first chapter of the Code of Ethics, it says, and I quote, "Museums are responsible for the tangible and intangible natural and cultural heritage," unquote. In the second chapter, this is qualified by stating, quote, "Museums have the duty to acquire, preserve, and promote their collections as a contribution to safeguarding the natural, cultural, and scientific heritage," unquote. The articles on valid title, provenance, fieldwork, culturally sensitive material, living collections, and others show that the acquisition and preservation of collections is subject to a general responsibility for the heritage of mankind. The use of the term safeguarding in this context is relevant. Safeguarding as key concept emerged in relation to the care for intangible heritage. In the UNESCO recommendation on the safeguarding of traditional culture and folklore of 1989, and the UNESCO Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage in 2003, safeguarding is defined as, quote, "measures aimed at ensuring the viability of the intangible cultural heritage, including the identification, documentation, research, preservation, protection, promotion, enhancement, transmission, particularly through formal and non-formal education, as well as the revitalization of the various aspects of such heritage." Safeguarding, revitalization. an active role of this heritage in society. The use of safeguarding in the context of a code of ethics for museums may be an indication of a new trend in professional ethics and the basis of new approaches to museological practice. If museums need to be replaced by something else, it will be something that justifies the principle of ensuring the viability of heritage. The radical position would be to follow Marinetti and to destroy museums and libraries in order to liberate heritage and art. Even though I consider Marinetti's text as ironic rhetoric rather than an encouragement to action, I will not suggest to close existing museums. I would rather advocate a change of perspective. We are used to define our world, we are used to define our field from the perspective of the canonized, modernist museum ideal. That is in the center of our perception of what our profession should be about. I am very interested not in the standardized museum model, although of course I have to refer to it, but I'm interested in the periphery. I'm interested in new concepts developing in the periphery of our professional field, challenging the standardized and canonized model. And in the end, I would like to take these alternative models as the center of my world, and I would redefine my world, my professional world at least, I would redefine it from the perspective of these bizarre, experimental, alternative, challenging models. And as I try to make clear in referring to Gould and referring to these UNESCO conventions on intangible heritage, I think this change of perspective, to find a sort of common denominator, I think this change of perspective should turn around redeveloping conceptualization. Reconceptualization, one of the basic concepts of museology. And projecting reconceptualization into the future, I will offer you three models. Three models that are once presented by an internet specialist. I forgot his name. Very famous. Jaime Cassio. Some years ago, he wrote a text, 3 reasons why your predictions of the future will go wrong. And he used this metaphor of these 3 animals, the dragon, the mule, and the black swan. And you suddenly recognize the title of this presentation, the subtitle of this presentation. The dragon, to Cassio, the dragon stands for a future, stands for a field that is still unexplored, that is new, not known, but maybe something dangerous. And he suggests that, of course, we should explore these new ideas, even though it makes us afraid. So we have to explore these new ideas, this new concept of musealization, new forms of institutionalizing musealization, even though it may challenge everything that we believe in. Although it may be the dragon that will mean the end of the existing modernist museum ideal. But there is also another model which Cassio described as the mule. The mule as something unexpected that could happen. The mule is something, well, in his text, something that could not be expected, something that emerges from an accident. As you know, mules originate from horses and donkeys. It's sort of unexpected phenomenon. And of course, our future will be full of unexpected phenomena, things that I'm not aware of, you not aware of, but that will certainly happen. And of course, we should be open to it. We should not avoid looking for these mules after they are born. Maybe we do not recognize their characteristics, but we should open to weak signals that show us something new that emerges on the horizon. But here, in the context of this presentation, I would like to look at black swans. Black swans, in Cassio's description, are phenomena that exist, alternatives that do exist already, but we may not be aware of it. We think about white swans. Swans, by definition, should be white, but of course, there have always been black swans. But maybe we're not aware of it. Our definition of swan is the swan is being white. But there is already this alternative, this other model. And what I would like to do with you is to explore not the dragons, maybe not the mules, but to explore some of the black swans. Because the future is already in the past. Already, a long time ago, alternatives were developed to the institutionalization of the process of musealization. As I already mentioned, musealization is one of the cornerstones of museology. In the accepted understanding of the term, musealization refers to the operation of extracting something physically or conceptually from its natural or cultural environment, and thus transforming it into a museum object. This use of the term goes back to the important Czechoslovakian museologist Zbigniew Stransky, and some of you here present know him very well. In Stransky's approach, the concept of musealization and the concept of museum are strongly related. However, increasingly, the term is used in a broader sense. In the sense, and I'd like to quote, a sense of transforming a center of life, which may be a center of human activity or a natural site, into a sort of museum. And I follow this description given in the ICOM publication Key Concepts in Museology, edited by André de Velay and François Mérès, published some 2 years ago. And I strongly, if you're interested in museology, I strongly recommend to download this brochure from the website of ICOM. This alternative use of the term, as given in Key Concept of Museology, goes in fact back to Herman Lübbe, left on the slide. In a lecture held in 1981 in London, Lübbe showed how the concept of musealization has permeated in society as a whole. He speaks about the dissolving physical and conceptual borders of the museum. He uses the word Entgrenzung, which is part of an increasing significance of history in our society. And he uses the word Vergangenheitszugewandtheit. Entgrenzung and Vergangenheitszugewandtheit are these very nice German terms that are very difficult to translate in English. But this increasing significance of history in our society is a reaction, or rather compensation, of the loss of identity in a rapidly changing world. But Entgrenzung, That is a key concept, going beyond the borders, beyond the physical, but also beyond the conceptual borders of the museum. Using musealization as sort of basic concept in looking at society at large. Obviously, in 1981, Lubbe was not aware of the new discourse in museology, known as museologie nouvelle, new museology, but I prefer to use the French term. A new discourse and new museum models that emerged from this discourse. These new museum models fit perfectly well in Lubbe's compensation theory, but show a more proactive ambition instead of the rather passive, accommodating policy stance that Lubbe described in his paper. It is my firm belief that the 1970s museum models are still extremely valid as source of inspiration for museum renewal in the 21st century, as they provide new institutional frameworks for addressing issues such as professional authority versus community participation and best versus second best options for safeguarding. These museum models, as developed in the early 1970s, are the black swans that are already there, but that we are not always aware of. The black swans that contribute to our understanding what museums are, what museums can be, or perhaps what in the future museums should be. The UNESCO regional seminar, known as the Round Table on the Development and the Role of Museums in the Contemporary World, in Santiago, Chile, organized in May 1972, proposed the concept of integrated museum, one of the most powerful concepts in our profession. The principles of the integrated museum can be recognized through a large number of developments in the last quarter of the 20th century to well into the 21st century. Integration taking place on 4 levels. The integration of the subject matter disciplines, so the integration of art history, history, anthropology, natural history, other disciplines. The integration of the museographical disciplines, so the integration of conservation, documentation, registration, exhibition, and education. The integration of heritage disciplines, so museum studies, archive studies, library studies, archaeology, care of monuments, and integration with society. In the 1972 guiding principles of the integrated museum, social relevancy is connected with an integrative approach to subject matter disciplines. To quote, "The variety and diversity of the problems confronting modern man will finally compel him to look on the world as one world, to be tackled as an integrated whole. All this implies that the trend should be towards establishment of integrated museums whose subjects, collections and exhibitions are interrelated with one another and with the natural and social environment of mankind." Unquote. This, in my opinion, would also require an integration of the heritage disciplines, because the same modern man is not interested whether his heritage is in a museum, an archive, a library, or elsewhere. The wish to achieve a better integration of museums in society resulted into new types of museums: community museums, neighborhood museums, eco-museums. These new concepts, new types of museums, were based on a strong involvement of local communities. The concept of eco-museum was introduced in 1971 by Georges-Henri Rivière and Hugues de Varine. I don't want to go into the origin and development of this term, but to summarize, the eco-museum is a manifestation of the integrated museum ideal on all these 4 levels. Eco-museum theoreticians have always emphasized that an eco-museum is not a building. As Hugues de Varine stated, an eco-museum is a fragmented museum. It is a conceptual context, conceptual framework, where heritage activities, where musealization and the communication of heritage takes place on a variety of places. Places that may be referred to as museums, but not necessarily so. Fragmented museum because all these initiatives are spread in the area, connected through the concept of an eco-museum. In situ, ex situ, in fondo, a network of heritage initiatives, and a framework for people to create, experience, and share their own experience. It is a fragmented museum, but it is very much a networked museum. The eco-museum model can easily be connected with the concepts of Web 2.0 and Web 3.0. I assume you have a basic understanding of these concepts. They represent 2 stages in the development of the internet. It's a little bit a complex slide, but the point is that this diagram is showing the progressive development of the internet along 2 axes. The vertical axis is connections between information, the horizontal axis connections between people. And what it shows is that in the internet we see an increasing connection between information, but also an increasing connection between people. And I think in conceptualizing museums, this sort of understanding of the development of internet is very helpful. Not just because as museums we should use internet as one of the instruments in the process of communication, but also as a sort of metaphor. It helps us to understand how in the field of heritage, how in the field of museums, we can develop an increasing connection between information and an increasing connection between people. Many museums are now in sort of development from Web 1.0 to Web 2.0. And those of you here representing museums, I think all your museums, they do have a website. And I'm aware, at least from 3 directors here in the audience, I know their museum, I know their websites, and I see that there is they made a major step from this Web 1.0 to this Web 2.0 perspective. But what is the challenge, I think, is to adapt the ideas of Web 3.0. And the challenge for developing museums into the future, or developing new sort of perspectives on musealization and the communication of heritage, is in understanding the principles of Web 3.0. And Web 2.0, as you know, it's very much about user generation content. It's about participation, inviting people to contribute to the content of museums in our case. People that are encouraged to create their own communities, not the communities based on ethnicity, language, or other traditional parameters. Free choice communities, internet communities, other communities. based on participation and exchange between the participants. This is what we call participatory culture. That is what we try to achieve in museums nowadays. Contemporary museums try to be part of a community, try to encourage participation, try to ask for this user-generated content, being an active member of a participatory culture. But not to reject these principles as being traditional and not longer valid, but next to this Web 2.0 philosophy, there should be, I think, the challenge of the Web 3.0 philosophy. Web 3.0 very much about connected content. Connected. Maybe user-generated, maybe professionally generated content, but connected. Connected content that is personalized, is made relevant for each of us individually. What can this content, what should this content mean for me as an individual, not necessarily as a member of a community? As museums, we tend to address our audience in terms of communities, target groups, communities. It's a standard language in our field. But to personalize the content, the connected content, that is an important challenge. And being part of a heritage community, being part of communities focused on a specific theme or a specific location. So participatory culture, network society, and the connection between both. So Web 3.0 and the challenge to the future of museums is making connections, and I avoid to speak about semantic web and so on, but the idea of making these connection between people, between places, connections between institutions. So, in fact, participating in this networked society. I think what I will say in the last part of my presentation is very much on this network. And if the museum should be replaced by something else, whether we call it a museum or not call it a museum, I think museums could be replaced by networks. And again, I repeat, it's not my intention to suggest that museums should be closed. But I think museums should perhaps hand over part of their central role, hand over part of their authority, and over part of their professional autonomy to networks. Networks with other initiatives, museums, but maybe other initiatives as well. I was involved in a project, and this is the publication of this project. Unfortunately, it's in Dutch, otherwise I could have given you a copy, but it makes no use. It's a huge project, about 1 million litas. So it's a huge project involving the participation of a large number of institutions. You can see there on the right-hand side of the slide. So it was a project about participation between training and research institutions, but in particular a collaboration between museums, archives, libraries, and that I think is the first step, replacing the museum perhaps by a network of museums with other heritage institutions, symbolized here in the cover of our book, Culture in Context. Looking for context, looking for relations, connections between objects in museum, archival documents in an archive, and books in a library, and profit from each other's expertise, profit from each other's information, looking, and that was the challenge and also the difficulty, and I must admit also the problem that we did not completely solve, looking for new definitions of metadata to make these connections possible. Culture in context. So the collections were the context of each other, and the theme was theater. It was about theater. And the idea behind this project was that a person, being a researcher, being a visitor to a museum, be it somebody just passing a theater building, to all those people, it's not relevant and not necessary, and it is even unproductive for these people to think, what sort of information can I find where? What information can I find in a museum, and what can I not find in a museum? For what sort of information should I go to an archive, and what can I find in a library? People have one interest, one question, and what we should provide is an infrastructure, a network to give answers to these questions and to help people to develop their questions. But this networked idea, being a museum, be it called a museum or something else, this culture in context, these connections should not, in my opinion, not be limited to these traditional institutions, museums, archives, and libraries. We should be open to new initiatives. Maybe we should connect the black swans with the mules in order to explore also the domain of the dragon. Very interesting new forms of institutionalization of heritage can be found. And again, we should be open for this. New, I hesitate to say new, but in academic discourse, quite new sort of discourses involve new types of heritage. Intangible heritage is something very popular nowadays in the academic world and also among politicians. Very substantial part of the discourse on heritage is about intangible heritage nowadays. And in the sphere of intangible heritage, you see new types of institutionalization, new types of musealization and the institutionalization thereof. And an example is connecting with my own experiences here in Vilnius. I visited a lot of museums, but also tried to explore other approaches to musealization. This is about intangible heritage. Food, culinary traditions are intangible heritage. Culinary traditions are very important part of heritage. Culinary traditions are being musealized. We all go to Chinese restaurants. There are a lot of them here in Vilnius. We go to Italian restaurants. There are a lot of them in this city. And Lithuanian restaurants. These are museums, if we broaden the concept of museums. These are heritage institutions. These are places of musealization, the musealization of culinary traditions. I hope you recognize these two restaurants. The upper one is more lower class, the lower one, the left one is more lower class, and the right one is more higher class. I was in the left one, not in the right one. A professor is not paid that much here. So it was my introduction, part of my introduction, to Lithuanian identity, because much of the identity is in the food. So I do not want to say whether I like the food or not, because that would say something about whether I like Lithuanian identity or not. I don't want to go into that discussion. But I must admit, I went to Italian restaurants afterwards. That was a joke. Sorry. I was not serious, of course not. So, these sort of alternatives, yeah? So, sort of ideal future would be the connection between this National Museum and one of these restaurants. Something like that. But there is more. I think what is important is this other connection that I was already referring to. In fact, this another connection connected with these ideas of Marinetti, ideas of Christine Cripps. This is a museum, about a museum in the Netherlands. It's a religious museum. It's not because the director of the Church Heritage Museum is sitting right in front of me. I didn't know that, but this is a religious museum. But there is an interesting sort of connection between the museum here in Vilnius and this museum. This museum is about a religious culture, not in churches, but among people mainly. So it's interested in how in daily life religion, and it's the southern part of the Netherlands, so religion by definition there is mainly a Roman Catholicism, how this religion plays a role in daily life. Yeah? But they know that in this process of secularization in the Netherlands, a lot of this religious heritage is disappearing. Yeah? People do not want to have statues of Jesus, Maria, and all saints in their houses any longer. Crosses in houses are disappearing. And the museum says, well, that is a pity. The museum said, well, don't destroy it. Give it to us. So staff of the museum is going to supermarkets, to markets, and to fairs, announced in the newspapers, saying, well, please come to us, bring your obsolete religious objects to us. And here on this slide you see the man on the right. So he offers a cross statue to one of the members of staff of the museum. It was a huge success. The project was mentioned, the museum saves Jesus. Sort of marketing term. But it shows here a sort of second best approach. Yeah? It says, well, okay, the best would be to keep these statues in the houses. But when the people do not want to keep these statues in their houses, perhaps they should bring it to us as a second best option. Other museums follow another sort of logic, another sort of policy. There are many museums about the Second World War in the Netherlands. They keep on receiving the same sort of objects, and they already have too many of them. So they tell the people not to donate these objects to the museum, but to keep them, to preserve them as part of their history. Perhaps not their personal history, but their family history. And the same project was part of the many projects in documenting the events of 9/11 in New York. The World Trade Center 2001. There are many institutional sort of projects in documenting this, but this is a special website created to help people to make decisions what is relevant for them and what should be preserved at home, preserved as family or community legacy for future generations. And I think if we speak about networks, if we speak about new forms of collaboration, this might be a direction accepting the fact that objects are not in museums, accepting the fact that objects are treasured in society, and that these objects maybe accumulate in other types of initiatives that may be called museums, but not necessarily so. Last year, Angela Janelli published a book called Wilde Museen, Wild Museums. And whether these initiatives that she is describing can be referred to as museums according to the standards that I referred to in the beginning is questionable. It's the museology of amateur museums. And she called it wild museums, wilde museen, because he refers to Claude Lévi-Strauss. As you know, Lévi-Strauss, anthropologists, make the distinction between pensée scientifique and pensée sauvage. This is an expression of pensée sauvage in museology. Community-based, or maybe even personal expressions of perception on the world, interpretation of the world in a wide range of initiatives, from official, recognized, accredited museums to something completely else. And that completely else is my last point. The pop-up museum. When one of the newest developments, the newest ideas very much discussed in the field of museums and museology is this concept of pop-up museum. You may be familiar with the concept of pop-up shops. Pop-up museums are also temporary initiatives. The idea is maybe not invented but developed by Michelle De Carlo. You see her there as a student. This is her student thesis based on practical museum work, especially supported by the Australian Museum in Sydney. And you see her in front of a pop-up museum. You see, nothing reminds us of the concept of museum. It is not the traditional concept of museum, it's something different. She calls it museum, or pop-up exhibition may be a more appropriate term. But it are temporary initiatives, spontaneously or well prepared, but based on the concept of conversation. Not conservation, but conversation. It is bringing people together. Bringing people together around a certain theme or whatever, and helping people to express themselves, bringing objects from their own houses, maybe historical objects, maybe heritage, maybe not heritage, but objects that serve one single purpose: conversation, exchange, communication. And here you see the physical layout is a series of tables. And people are invited to sit at the table to have sort of dialogue using object, heritage, and other media to facilitate this dialogue. And maybe to create something, a sort of shared enterprise, maybe communicate the product with others, but not necessarily so. So it's a part of community development, it's a part of a new understanding of the role of heritage, and we going to the core of the concept of heritage, communication. If you want to know more about pop-up museum, well, it's very simple. Of course, you Google, and there's also Facebook. Michelle De Carlo has her own Facebook site, so additional information, examples of pop-up exhibitions can be found there. And here you see the simple rules that she suggests, be respectful, be kind, be comfortable. Being respectful with the different sort of ideas that are living in our society, different communities, different forms of heritage. And if you want to organize pop-up exhibitions here in Vilnius, well, there is a blueprint, a guideline saying exactly what you should do. A very American, very Australian approach, and also with evaluation forms. In itself, pop-up events in this direction are not so new. We are familiar with that sort of events here. I'm not sure what this referring to, but it was a sort of very traumatic sort of an event. I think it was not 9/11, but something else. And you see people are creating sort of community exhibition. They are adding sort of homemade posters, photographs, objects, flowers to commemorate the victims of a certain event. So it was not a purpose-made pop-up exhibition, but it's a principle. I think it is a shared sort of experience, an expression of that experience as a form of communication. And this is a purpose created pop-up exhibition somewhere in Mexico, I think, where they asked the stall owners of a market to express something of their history and why they think this market is important. Here, some other examples. And it's a sort of wild museum. It is the pensée sauvage, is how people want to express themselves. Any professional museum is just facilitating the process, is organizing the process. But the people decide, the people themselves decide what to show and how to show it. So it's a wild museum, it's a wild exhibition design. It is not a sophisticated exhibition design. But there are other forms. And the last example is an example from the Historic Museum in Frankfurt in Germany. And they were using this idea of pop-up museums, working with the community. This is not a purpose-built museum building. The building is not owned by the museum. The building is an office building, and it happens to be empty. So it was very convenient. They could use an empty building that was available in the center of an area, a neighborhood that was in the process of development. And they wanted to do research together with people and organizations in this neighborhood. They want to explore the potential lines of development, to discuss the future of this area. So it was very much based on the principles of the pop-up museum, but in this case, we have a very sophisticated design. They invited well-known museum designers, happen to be Dutch, but that is coincidence, Cosman de Jong, because they felt that perhaps they would be more convincing if there was a more sophisticated design, but a design as a framework, not a design defining what the participants wanted to share. So some pictures, very personal sort of stories. Individuals living in this area were sharing stories, how they came. There are many immigrant people, in this case I think a Chinese person, and a Chinese woman telling how she came and the first impressions of her arrival. Here somebody from the Ukraine with a tape with music from the Ukraine, which reminds her of home, and the mobile phone to stay in contact with her relatives. So very personal stories, but also the more official stories. These are the last remains of a former synagogue in the area, donated or added to this exhibition by a group that are interested in the history of this synagogue, but also factories in the area. So a sort of advanced model of a pop-up museum, an advanced model based on networking, based on bringing all sorts of initiatives together, a very successful sort of approach. So the Rotterdam Historical Museum recently decided to close the doors and to continue working according to this model of pop-up museums. And you cannot visit the Rotterdam Historical Museum any longer. Of course, there is a storage. They do have a collection. They do have staff spaces. But the real museum, well, now we have a discussion what is real, but the communication dimension of the museum is spread over the city. What they organize are pop-up exhibitions in all parts of the city, together with the people living in that. And again, I do not want to suggest the director and the deputy director of this museum to close the doors and to start organizing pop-up exhibitions in different parts of Vilnius, although it would be a very interesting and intriguing thought. And I hope, with me, you'll start to become interested in this sort of alternatives, either being a staff member of this museum, another museum, or a future museum worker, or anything else. Please be open, try to explore the domain of the dragons, be prepared for the mules, and know that there are a lot of black swans already available. But please, try to be different. Thank you.